who created a lovely Pakistan. And somebody has given her or it the name of Wild Frontiers. I think it should not be not so wild frontiers. Anyways, I would like to recognize Mr. Mick Kunfrey. If I see him, I will recognize. Most welcome. Mr. Matthew Green, the journalist, great. And of course, the founder, Johnny. And ladies and gentlemen, a very, very good evening to you and a very warm welcome to Pakistan High Commission. Your presence here tells me and shows me what a great interest you have in my lovely country and the tourism there. What I'll do is I'll take a very small amount of your time because I like to listen from him and maybe some other speakers. What are their views about tourism in my lovely country? But I would say, as cold water to thirsty soul, so is the good news from a far country. It is the opening proverb of a great book, The Price of a Dream. It is real, depiction of a sort of miracle which has changed the life of millions, and it goes very rightly for Pakistan. Tornare, that is the Latin origin of the word tourism, or tornos as Greeks used to call it, meaning circles. So if you go to Pakistan, come back, and again go to Pakistan and come back, it's a circle. Once you climb K2, the other time you go to Satpara Lake, lovely lake, natural, in which you can see these scaling peaks and like snowy looks and all that. It's so clear water that you can, it's like a mirror if I call it. You can see the cracks and crevices on one's face, so as to say. A great country, great. Now what I say in Europe, in the developed world, or in the West I would say, the tourism started with, first of all, domestic tourism. And it was only after World War II when the international tourism started. Though many people have traveled, like in the 19th century or even 13th centuries, Marco Polo's travels, and but Thomas Cook, I think, is considered as the founder of modern tourism. Pakistan, I would say, is the largest country of South Asia, second only to India. And we got independence in 1947. I won't say from whom, but of course from British government. We have great four seasons, like it's the blossoming spring. It is the sunny winters and hot summers with chirping leaves autumn. And we harbor 7 out of 8 peaks of the world. The northern areas are most beautiful, adorned with great flora and fauna. It is the country of flowing rivers with mighty Indus, 5 rivers in Punjab, and a long coastline, the Indian Ocean, with grey sand beaches. 2 great religions were conceived here, Buddhism and the Sikh religion. It is the valley of 5,000 years old Indus Valley civilization and the world's oldest necropolis. Now that is a little introduction of Pakistan. But if I go towards the economic concepts of tourism, so tourism has become an important industry in the contemporary times. And if I would say, according to the statistical analysis of 2010, I couldn't find the latest one, it contributes about 10% to the GDP of the world. In our country, we are developing the latest trends in ecotourism. In general, it differs from the traditional tourism in two main aspects. Firstly, we are trying to ensure the viability of our ecosystem. That is, and secondly, it is to ensure and promote sustainable tourist industry. Ecotourism has become an important industry for developing as well as the developed world, seeking to maximize foreign exchange earnings, sustainable employment, and secure financial resources to conserve natural and cultural heritage. Thus, presumably, they can contribute not only to the GDP, but also in conserving the ecosystem of a country. Otherwise, it would be destroyed. It will start going down, and so on and so forth. Gilgit-Baltistan, I think about which you're going to speak, even Lahore and Karachi, Peshawar, and other cities, if you go to Kailash Valley, it gives you the sense of the old Greek civilization, where they have their own god, own way of life, own culture. But one thing is really amazing, they speak elegant English. And it is so impressive, you'll see a lovely Kailashi woman passing by you and she will ask, how's my hairs? And you would like to have a photograph with her. It is a jeepable way of 2.5 hours journey on a very, very, I would say, wide frontier. Because a little whisk of eye, this way or that way, will take you into the river Chitral, which is about 7,000 feet down. And that is a wide frontier. And similarly, I myself, when I was doing my course, this specialized course for senior officers, I wrote a paper on tourism, and I invented a term what we call the cultural tourism. With the cultural tourism, I mean, if you go to our city of Lahore and you just get a chance to see the horse and cattle show, or you go to an open-air theater and you get a chance to see a Punjabi drama. They use many words of English, so it is not difficult to understand. It gives you the sense of culture, the viability of culture, the continuity of our culture, and our adherence with that for centuries and years. It is really remarkable. However, now the tinges, I won't say tinges, rather permanent sort of effects of globalization have started appearing. We also do opera, in which we do Hamlet, or Romeo and Juliet. So we do, like somewhere, the opera in central London, we go and see the Antony and Cleopatra. So these things are also happening, but these are signs of modernization and globalization, what I call. But I can assure you, ladies and gentlemen, Pakistan is a lovely country. And if you visit once, I can assure you, you will going to visit it again and again. And with, once again, thanking your presence there in such a numbers, which gives us a great heart that our tourism industry is going to grow again. I welcome you, and I thank you, and welcome the High Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Without taking further time, I'll now invite Johnny Bielby. It was in Pakistan that Johnny was inspired to set up an adventure travel company. And I'm sure many of you have traveled with him there, making Pakistan both the brainchild of Wild Frontiers and its first ever destination. He has been back well over 20 times since then, with close friendships established in northern Pakistan. In his opinion, there is no better adventure travel destination. From the wide open space and freedom felt on the Shandur Pass, where the mountains of the Hindu Kush transformed into the steppes of Central Asia, to the magical landscapes in and around the Hunza Valley, surrounded everywhere with magnificent peaks, Johnny wrote for a pagan song about traveling across remote Pakistan. So Johnny, please.
I'm actually going to use this mic rather than that one there, just to be different. Thank you very much, Ishla, and thank you very much, Dr. Hussain, for those kind introductions. And what I must say is thank you so much for allowing us to come to the Pakistan High Commission and use this fabulous facilities, not least the samosas, the pakoras, and the coffee, which were absolutely delicious. Shan't be needing supper tonight. So, Pakistan. Well, I've had some of my thunder kind of taken away from me because that was a bit of my introduction. And Dr. Hussain, you are absolutely right when you say that some parts of northern Pakistan are a wild frontier. In fact, it was named, my company was named after the northwest frontier as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, as it's called today, it used to be known. And so what I'm going to do, just very briefly, is take you through the story of how my relationship with Pakistan developed and how Wild Frontiers was born and the reasons why we kind of created this company and what we do in northern Pakistan. So to take you back, it's 1991. I drove a motorbike right the way around the African continent. I turned south at Clapham Junction and I didn't turn north again until Cape Town, which is about as far as I could go. When I came back up the east coast, I got back to London and I wrote a book about this journey, which was called Running with the Moon. The book did reasonably well, and this kind of threw up a bit of a dilemma. Was I now a writer, a travel writer? The publishers wanted me to go and write another book, so I decided, okay, let's give it a go. And immediately I knew which book I wanted to write. I wanted to do a journey in the footsteps of Rudyard Kipling's characters, Peachy Carnahan and Daniel Dravot, as they travelled fictionally, of course, from Rajasthan, a place called Marwar Junction, through what was then British India and into the Hindu Kush in search of this mythical land called Kafiristan, land of the unbelievers, which was full of pagan tribes worshipping a plethora of interesting sounding gods. So I grew my beard, I put on a turban, and like Peachy and Danny before me, I travelled from Marwar Junction. I'll show you the route now. This is the route. I started in Marwar Junction, which is where Kipling's story begins. Travelled up to Delhi, from there up the Grand Trunk Road, and across into Pakistan. Now, I've got to be honest, when I kind of set out to do this journey, I obviously knew I was going to be starting in India, and I'd been to India before, and I knew quite a lot about India, and I knew I was travelling into Afghanistan. But I didn't really put that much thought on the bit in between, Pakistan, dare I say that standing here. But as soon as I crossed the border into Lahore, you cross the Wagah border, which is the only border point between India and Pakistan that one can cross as a foreigner. I crossed the border and immediately I was just amazed by this incredible world that I'd stumbled into. Lahore is a magnificent city. It's a very lively, vibrant city, but it's a city of great history. And not only do you have obviously the Badshai Mosque, which is very similar to the Jama Masjid in Delhi. You have the Lahore Fort. It was one of the capitals of the Mughal rulers, of course. You have the British history with the British Cathedral. You have what, in my opinion, is I think the most beautiful mosque I've ever seen in my life, in the Wazir Khan Mosque. And you have a great reference to Kipling in the Zamzamar canon. Any of you that know your Kim will know that it was on the Zamzamar that Kim sat in defiance of municipal orders. And so this gave my story a nice kind of link between the Kipling side of things. But it was also here that I started to meet Pakistani people, and just for the first time started to realize just how hospitable and friendly and fascinating this place was and the people that lived there. I didn't travel, this was April 1996. I didn't travel directly up to Peshawar and on into Afghanistan. I decided I needed a bit of training for the mountains. Now, I'm a farmer's boy from Lincolnshire. I come from a place that I think is about 20 metres above sea level. So the idea of walking over these high passes did fill me with a little bit of dread. So the first thing I did was I travelled north up the Karakoram Highway. It was a 16-hour bone-shattering journey on an old NAPCO bus. Northern Areas Transport Corporation. It did something like that. But when I arrived in Hunza, I realised that I'd actually seen no more beautiful sight in my life. It was absolutely stunning, and I'm not sure I still ever have seen anywhere more beautiful, to be honest. Arrived in Hunza, and this is the scene that I saw. The mountains of Hunza, for those of you that don't know or haven't been, are simply breathtaking. Can I just have a show of hands? How many people here who haven't been to Pakistan have seen an 8,000 metre peak? Is that Everest? Okay, so that means quite a few of you, it's a good number, have not Everest? Everest. Have trekked to the base camp of Everest, I expect. The thing about northern Pakistan is that you can see 8,000 metre peaks, and indeed a whole plethora of 7,000 metre peaks, without getting out of the vehicle, which I suppose is a good thing and a bad thing. From the Hunza Valley, you see 7,000 metre peaks all around you. And this is a view that is common in Hunza. This is a place that we take our groups to now. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. But I was travelling up on another NATCO bus from Gilgit up to Hunza, and I was sitting on the roof of the bus, as we do. It's too packed inside. I'm not sure one does that today, but we did in the mid-90s. And I was staring out, looking out to my left, looking out over the valley. And I don't know about you, but I quite like to travel a little bit blind. I don't read lots of guidebooks and read lots of things before I go, because I quite like to see things as they kind of come to me, rather than preempting what they're going to be like by reading guidebooks. This chap tapped me on the shoulder and made me turn around, and I looked around, and oh my God, there was Mount Rakaposhi, right in front of me, 7,788 metres. I'd never seen a mountain anything like the size of that, and it was stunning. And I still have this kind of trick with our groups today, where we come around this corner and there's the peak that you see. So, you know, these mountains are absolutely vast, but really quite accessible, which makes journeying up here, of course, so spectacular. But I was in a vehicle there, and what I needed to do was test myself walking, because once I got into the Hindu Kush, I was going to be travelling over 4,600, 4,700 metre passes. Now, if you think that Mont Blanc is 4,800 metres, we're talking about just the passes being virtually the same height. As I say, I had never travelled at altitude, I'd certainly never walked at altitude, so I needed to do a trek. So the trek that I did followed the Gilgit River, due west from Gilgit, up towards the Shandor Pass. And when I got to the Shandor Pass, it took me about 5 days to walk up as far as a place called Barsat, which is the last village in the valley. As I started getting closer to Barsat, the weather completely turned, and it was an April day. It was sunny one minute, and then suddenly a big blizzard came in, and I was walking in the snow. Got to the last village, had to hold up there. The storm didn't break for 8 days. I was stuck in this very nice chap's shop come home, eating, all he had was dal and eggs, and that's basically what we lived on for the next 8 days, waiting for the snow to stop. Eventually it did, the guide that I kind of reconnoitred from that village came to me and said, okay, we'll go tonight at midnight. And I said, what are you talking about, go tonight at midnight? Can't we go tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning, like any normal person? He said, no, you have to go at night, because there's so much snow now that at night it freezes. We can walk across the snow, on top of the snow. If we go at 7 o'clock in the morning, you'll be trudging through the snow, and it's a nightmare. So, sure enough, he came along at midnight, picked me up. I had every single bit of clothing that I possessed on, and we walked all the way. You can see the picture on the top right is what's called the Langar. This is a flat plain of land. Langar actually means free kitchen. It's where all the locals take their yaks and donkeys and horses to feed. But it was covered in snow. And we walked across this. The moon, full moon was coming up, middle of the night, absolutely breathtakingly beautiful, white, still. We walked right the way along that, which is 15 kilometres, and then up to the top of the pass at 4,000 metres, which was quite a struggle in the snow as the dawn was breaking, but was absolutely amazing. And I got to the top and realised, okay, I can walk at 4,000 metres, it's not going to kill me. Came down the other side to Mastouj, and then bottom right is onto Chitral. I didn't then, what I did then was go back down to the shower, where I stayed for a little while, getting my some logistics sorted out before I then travelled over the Khyber Pass. You can see the Khyber Pass, all the trucks going down on the far side, and then on into Afghanistan. Here I had a group of mujahideen and guides and translators, top left, that helped me travel my way through this land that was Kafiristan, but is now Nuristan. Very briefly, 1893, the British drew up the border, what was then the western border of British India with Afghanistan. That gave the Amir in Afghanistan the chance to go into this place called Kafiristan, which was full of these unruly pagan tribes, convert them all at the end of the sword, which is considered to be the last mass conversion in history, and renamed it Nuristan, meaning land of light. So Kafiristan, land of the unbelievers, Nuristan, land of light, or land of the enlightened. So, but they weren't very enlightened, to be perfectly honest. When I travelled through Nuristan, it was an incredibly scary and dangerous journey. We got shot at, we got kidnapped, we got all sorts of stuff went on. But we did manage to come out the other side, over a 4,600 metre pass, into the Kalash valleys. Dr. Hussain mentioned the Kalash valleys. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. But what was important for me and for this story, which I'm kind of getting to the end of, is that I met this man, Saifullah. And Saifullah is one of the leading spokespeople for the Kalash. He's a highly educated man, speaks perfect English. And I was so relieved to have got out of this war-torn, to have got through this war-torn Afghanistan unscathed. And to meet this incredibly friendly, nonchalant, very different people, I decided to put my bags down and I stayed for 3 months. And the important point from the book's point of view was that this is what most people regard as the last bit of Kafiristan, because they are pagan, they are not Muslim, therefore to many they are unbelievers. The Kalash don't like this term because they say we have our own religion. But so this was kind of finding the last remnants of Kafiristan, of which Kipling's book, of course, denoted. Oh, sorry, one last thing about Saifullah. Nearly forgot the most important point. It was him that said to me, you should set up a travel company and bring tourists here. And I said, I don't know anything about travel company. I write these silly travel books. He said, no, you should. You should. And he introduced me to an Italian chap who was doing just that. And this Italian chap had 15 French there. And he told me how much he was charging the French. And I thought, did the sums quick and thought, yeah, there's a lot more money in that than there is in travel writing. I shouldn't say that to you, but anyway. So I came back, and once I finished writing for a pagan song, I went back out to Pakistan, did a very quick recce around northern Pakistan, put an advert in the paper, and got my first clients, and one of whom, I'm pleased to say, is sitting at the back there. Stuart, look at him. There is Stuart. One of 2 clients, and Stuart very nobly and bravely came with me on the first ever trip that I did. Now, this is the route, roughly, that we did on that occasion, and it's still the backbone of the routes that we do today. It's worth mentioning, and so just very briefly, it's pretty much a loop from Islamabad up to Chitral, over the Shandor Pass down to Gilgit and Hunza, across to Skardu, and back round via Astor to Fairy Meadows. It's worth mentioning that in the 90s, tourism was a major part of the economy in northern Pakistan. Indeed, when I first started doing my trips up there, was the Khyber Steam Train. Now, if you didn't buy your tickets for the Khyber Steam Train 6 months in advance, you didn't get on it. If I didn't book up my hotels, the PTDC, particularly the Pakistan government hotels, which are strategically located at certain points, a year in advance, I didn't get my groups in. We were camping. You know, when you were going down the Gilgit Valley, you found people mountain biking, horse riding, rafting, Japanese Buddhist tour groups. I mean, you found all sorts of people up there. It was a really popular tourist destination. Of course, sadly for Pakistan, all that changed, really, with 9/11. But for my money, it's absolutely all still open for business, and we've been going back there ever since. We lost 2 years in 2002 and 2003. We took Michael Palin in 2003 for his Himalaya program, and that kind of kick-started the whole thing again. But the trip started in Islamabad, which is a good city to start in because it's quite an easy city. It's a new city, built in the 60s for the creation of New Pakistan. It's therefore very easy. The main site, if you like, of course it's not a site to Muslim people, but for us is the Faisal Mosque, which was a gift from King Faisal in, I think, 1974. But from there we travel up to Chitral. Now Chitral is this kind of sleepy little backwater that during the time of the Great Game was this point at which the British were worried that the Russians were going to come in over the passes, and so they basically paid the local king to remain loyal to Britain, which he did for many years. We stay in the Mountain Inn, which is a lovely kind of, I call it Faulty Towers of the Hindu Kush. The service level's on great, but the garden's beautiful. Interestingly, this is Chitral Fort, and Chitral Fort is a very kind of important point for British kind of history, British military history particularly, because it was here that there was a very important siege that took place in 1895. As I said, there was this one king who was ruler for 30 years, a chap called Anan ul Mulk, that the British paid a suzerainty to keep him loyal to Britain. When he died, he had 60 sons. Okay, he was a vibrant man. When he died with his 60 sons, obviously there was a bit of a kerfuffle as to who was going to be the next ruler. The British wanted one person, the locals didn't agree. The British had about 20 British officers and some sepoys there. The locals surrounded the fort and laid siege to it. Now this is just after Gordon of Khartoum. The last thing the British wanted was another massacre on the outskirts of Empire, so they sent 2 relief columns, one going over the Shandor Pass, the other coming over the Luari Pass. The Shandor Pass got there first and relieved the siege, and it was all okay. But it was for 2 months, Calcutta and Whitehall held their breath, not knowing exactly what was going to happen to these soldiers up there in the fort. It's great now. The recent the Mete, the King's Call Mete is there, and the new Mete, who's just taken over from his father who died a couple of years ago. And I say taken over, it's all totally, they don't have the power anymore. It's all purely ceremonial, if you like. But inside the fort, he has now opened it up and has done some really good renovations, and it's actually a fascinating place to go around. And the reason why I show you this is because he's got all sorts of stuff in there, from swords and stars of the Garter, an amazing photograph collection. But this is a letter, and can you see the date? That says the 12th of August, 1947, sorry. So as we all know, that's 2 days before partition, and it's a letter from Mountbatten to the then Meta, apologising that he can't get up for a hunting expedition this summer, but he wishes the Meta very well and hopes that the good relations between the Meta of Chitral and the people of Britain will continue. So it's fascinating. And what's great is today, those relationships from the ancestors of those royal families still very much exist. And we stay with them and can learn a great deal about their past through them. So this is a chap called Maksud ul Mulk, who's the great-great-nephew of Anan ul Mulk. We stay with him in Ayyun at his little guest house, and he's a lovely chap that will talk to us about all the history of the family, so very much still alive. We'll of course watch a game of frontier polo, which the Chitralis love so much, or everyone in the northern areas, and we'll drive around in these beautiful jeeps, which give the whole trips up there a great kind of flavour. The first main place you're going to come to in Chitral is the Kalash Valleys. Now, we've mentioned them already. The Kalash are an extraordinary tribe. The fact that they have managed to survive and maintain their pagan beliefs whilst being surrounded by a conservative Islam for 1,000 miles in all directions is pretty remarkable. I often read stories about the Kalash's days are numbered, their culture is being eroded, they're being forced conversion. It's not at all what I see. I've been going there for 20 years, and I see a very vibrant culture, very passionate about their beliefs. And in the 1970s, this was true. There were quite a lot of forced conversions, but the Pakistani government stepped in, and through their minority tribes ministry, really helped out and started to protect the Kalash, and have really taken an active interest in making sure that the Kalash not only survive, but prosper. And interestingly, the biggest issue the Kalash have today is land. Their numbers have gone from 2,500 in the mid-70s to over 4,000 today, but of course their land isn't growing, and it's not as if the Kalash, with their culture as you see here, can simply just go and live in another part of Pakistan. So it's limited how much space they have. They are animistic, it's a animistic pagan, they worship different ancestral gods and gods of varying goat gods and honeybee gods and various things, and they celebrate their religion at these colourful festivals which happen 4 times every year. There's a trip going next week in May, and I'm delighted to say that I'm going to be taking the trip in May 2017, which is what I try to do every other year. So I'll be taking the trip back here for the festival of Joshi next year. The Qazis, that's this chap here, they are the spiritual leaders of the Kalash. They are the ones that are called guardians of the legends. They hold the stories of the Kalash in their heads, and they sing them at these festivals. And if you can see this guy here, you see he's got some rupees shoved in his hand. Basically, they act as human jukeboxes. And the old women come up and stuff some rupees in their hat, whisper a song in their ear, and they'll sing that song for them. And they dance, and it's just a beautiful time. Of course, this is the festival of Joshi. This is where they are celebrating the planting season, so they are getting rid of all the bad spirits out of the valley in preparation for the planting season. And some of our clients get involved as well. But we also, perhaps more remarkably, go up there for the winter festival. And this is the winter solstice festival where the Kalash really go for it. They make wine, that's part of their culture, and they drink an awful lot of it during their winter festival. And we go up there and celebrate this amazing event with them. One of the things I was so surprised about when I did this is just how similar it is to our Christmas event, where presents are given, the best clothes are put on, they all eat dried fruit and have a big meal, and all gather around at friends and family dwellings. Very, very similar. One of the things you have to do, though, if you want to go for this particular trip, is to purify yourself. The whole valley is purified. It gets rid, again, of all the evil spirits that are built up throughout the year. The way the girls do that is they dress up in the Kalash clothing, and they have a hot bucket bath in one of the loos. For the men, it's slightly different. You have to go to the goat sacrifices, and then when the goat is sacrificed, you have the blood splattered across your face. Not as much as this chap who thoroughly enjoyed himself. It's an incredible and extraordinary privilege to be with the Kalash at this time when they are celebrating this. It's really as close as we get, I think, to stepping into the pages of National Geographic. And we get permission from the elders to be able to bring a group and experience Joshi with them. And effectively, we become Kalash for those 5 days. And we dance around the fire at night in true pagan style. The second part of that trip is we try to find the snow leopards of northern Chitral. Many of you will remember the amazing film David Attenborough of Planet Earth. Well, this is where that was shot. I was up there taking a group when the BBC film crew were there a year later making another film, and this was a photograph I took of the snow leopard. Now, the brilliant thing was, you can see here, I'll just put that photograph back in again, these big lenses. I didn't realise, but the lenses are on the tripod, not the camera. So when the BBC camera crew got overexcited that the snow leopard was there and went rushing off, they left their lenses. So I kind of just looked around, put my own camera on their lenses, and hence got that photograph. It wasn't that close to me, but wonderful experiences. From here, we head on out of Chitral, travelling up these absolutely incredible roads up to Masdouj. I just like this photograph, I think it's many years ago. Not a tourist paradise. In many ways it is. Not for the facilities, but this is a typical PTDC, Pakistan Tourist Development Corporation hotel. But they are superbly located. They're perfectly comfortable enough for a night as you're on a road trip over through the Hindu Kush. And this is where, for me, the kind of mountains of the Hindu Kush blend into the steppes of Central Asia. You're very close here to Afghanistan's Wakhan corridor, to Tajikistan, very, very close indeed. And we do some walking up here and come down the other side in towards Gilgit. And from here head up to Hunza. And for anybody on one of these journeys, Hunza is an absolute highlight. James Hilton, Shangri-La, this is really a pure, stunning place where allegedly people live to be very old because of the great climate, the great food. They have a great amount of wonderful cherries and apricots and yogurts and all these kind of things. It's a fabulous place. On my first trip here, I stayed at the Eagle's Nest, which at the time was literally just one room. I'm pleased to say that Ali Madat, who owns the land there, this is at a place called Doika, which is 500 metres above the valley floor, has now converted it into a fabulous 30-room, small but little guest house where we stay. And this is our breakfast in the morning. Absolutely stunning location for our breakfast. Head of the table, Susie. Well, you can't imagine having a breakfast at any more spectacular place. And that's really the thing about Hunza. I come back to the point. I don't think there's anywhere on earth that is so accessible, showing such extraordinary landscapes. We go for walks, careful with your footing, and we travel up the Karakoram Highway towards China. Now, this photograph, which has, I have to say, earned us a lot of clients, sadly no longer exists, because what is in its place now is this. In 2010, massive rock slides filled the Hunza Valley and blocked it, and therefore the river, the Hunza River, formed a 22-kilometre long lake. And what one does now is travel, I see a few of you here, they're in the photograph, travel up this lake by boat. Now, I should say, I met somebody earlier who was saying to me that the Chinese have now built a road going all the way around. I mean, amazing, they built it so quickly. Tunnels, 5 tunnels and a road going all the way around the lake. However, somebody said to me they got stuck in a landslide the other day and were stuck in the tunnel overnight. So I think the boat is still probably the preferable option, and it's good fun. So then travelling from there, Fairy Meadows, this is one of the places where... Interesting way to access the high commission. A rope or something. Obviously, 8,000 metre peaks, not that easy places to find without hiking an awfully long way. Nanga Parbat from Fairy Meadows, again, you get that beautiful view. And then we travel on to Skardu. And this is kind of heading all the way east in northern Pakistan, up towards, getting to areas very close to places like Ladakh and Kashmir. And the Indus River, as Dr. Hussain was talking about, flowing through here, fairly gentle phase of its life, but as it goes from there, it crashes through a series of really narrow cliffs into a great maelstrom before it kind of eventually comes out onto the plains of the Punjab and down into Sindh. And again, one thing you might be surprised to see is that there are some fantastic hotels up here. This is called Kaplu Palace. It was converted by the Serena Group into an absolutely sumptuous place. If you think of kind of heritage hotels in Rajasthan, for example, this is the equivalent with the Tibetan feel, because this area was kind of ruled by various different people with links to Tibet and Ladakh. Absolutely amazing hotel, one of my favourite hotels. And from here, we travel on up the Hershey Valley to where Wild Frontiers Foundation has our first school. In 2010, we did a trek to K2 where we raised £20,000 and we built a school up here in a place called Balagon. And the money that has come in tonight from the raffle and from your entrance and everything goes towards that school to helping the children there. We now educate 108 different children. The government, which is great, have now taken over the payment of the teachers, which is really important to get that relationship going. And without support like this, there simply wouldn't be any school up there. So that is really the kind of breadth of northern Pakistan, taking the northern parts of what is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, that was the northwest frontier, and the northern areas of Gilgit-Baltistan. And as, again, Ijlal explained, I have great friendships that have endured for many, many years. This is Saifullah, taken last year at the Joshi Festival, and he calls me, I don't know, once every couple of weeks. He was on the phone to me yesterday. How many people are coming for the Joshua this year? And we've maintained a fantastic friendship. And it's this that kind of takes me back time and again. It's the people, you know. It so often is the case, the landscapes, the history, the architecture, the cuisine, that's all great. But without the people, it's only really half the story. And the people of Pakistan have been so generous to me. Somebody asked me the other day, give me an example of tourists, of you as a tourist getting the benefits of hospitality. And I told them a story that's happened not once but twice. Travelling up the Karakoram highway, stopping for lunch in a local Durbar restaurant, Chai Khana, going to pay my bill and finding it's already been paid. I never met the person, he never said, I'm paying your bill, it was just paid. Can you imagine going into a little chef and coming to pay your bill to find out some random person has already paid your bill? That's what happens in Pakistan, an amazing country. So, that is me, and that is Pakistan, and if you'll forgive me a moment, I'm just going to put my glasses on, because I now need to introduce somebody who's going to give you an absolutely riveting story. So, Mick Comfrey is an award-winning documentary maker and writer. His TV credentials include Mountain Men and Icemen for BBC, and the BBC's 50th anniversary film of the first ascent of Everest. His books include The Adventurer's Handbook, Everest 1953, and most importantly, and what we're going to hear about tonight, the utterly epic Ghosts of K2. So without further ado, please welcome Mick Comfrey.
Thank you very much for coming and for having me. I'm very grateful. It's quite an interesting, complicated story, so I'm going to go through it reasonably quickly. I started life as a documentary maker for the BBC, and I was lucky enough that my niche became exploration and mountaineering. And I made a couple of series, one about the Arctic called Icemen, one about great mountain stories called Mountain Men, and went and filmed in K2. More recently, I've been doing more writing, and so I've revisited some of the films that I made and gone back into the archives, because what you find is that as these stories go on, the downside is that a lot of the people who are involved die. The upside is that they donate their diaries to archives and their letters to archives. So sometimes you're able to find out a little bit more about the story than you were when they were alive. So, so the book is called The Ghost of K2. It goes from the first expedition to K2 in 1902 up to the first ascent in 1954. And it's based on archive documents and diaries and newspaper cuttings and kind of original material from the time. So I'll start. Simple question, where is K2? Johnny has touched on it. It's on the border of China and Pakistan. When the first attempts were made, this whole area was called Kashmir, but after partition, it was divided between India and Pakistan. It's still a very disputed issue, but K2 is in the Pakistani-controlled area, and it's an amazing bit of the world. You get some sense of it from the photographs that Johnny has given you, but you have some of the kind of longest glaciers in the world surrounding these huge mountains. Most people think about the Himalayas as being where you find the really big mountains, but actually the Karakoram in Pakistan has probably got more 8,000 meter peaks, I think, than the Himalayas. K2 is the mountain on the left on the screen, soaring above all the others around it. It's the second highest mountain in the world, 600 feet shorter than Everest. To the right, there's Broad Peak, another 8,000 meter peak, another huge challenge. The thing about K2 as opposed to Everest is that it is relentlessly steep, whereas there is a kind of, not an easy route, but there is what is termed now the Yak route, which a lot of people climb Everest via the Southeast Ridge. There is no easy way up K2. And so if you look at the numbers, since the first ascent of Everest in *53, about 4,000 people have reached the summit. Since the first ascent of K2 in 1954, it's about 330, 340. Much, much more difficult, much, much more exposed, high altitude, extreme weather, extreme climbing. it got its name K2 simply from the fact that it's in the Karakoram. When the Karakoram was first surveyed, the surveyors didn't know the local names for mountains, and so they gave them K numbers. So they had K1, K2 up to K10. And then subsequently they went back and they tried to find out what the local name was, but because K2 was so remote, there wasn't an agreed local name. There were various small villages would have names, but there's no agreed, whereas at Everest, there is an established Nepali name Sagarmatha, there's an established Tibetan name Chomolungma. There was no agreed name for K2, so that designation, which was just an abbreviation, is stuck. The first expedition to go to K2 was a British-European one from 1902, and it was led by two very interesting characters. One was called Oscar Eckenstein, who was a very famous mountaineer. But this character here is Aleister Crowley, who became famous. He was known as the Great Beast 666. He was a sort of proto-hippie who ended up on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's because he was very interested in sex, drugs, and Eastern mysticism. But in his early days, he was a very keen mountaineer and co-led the first attempt on K2. This is him after, on the way back from K2. He said that he didn't wash for 85 days. The second expedition to K2 was in 1909 and was led by an Italian called the Duke of Abruzzi, who at that time was probably one of the most famous explorers in the world. He'd made attempts on the North Pole, he'd climbed the Ruwenzori Mountains in Africa, he had climbed Mount St. Elias in Alaska, and he wanted to go to K2 because you couldn't get into Everest at this time. It wasn't accessible because it was both Nepal and Tibet were closed countries. And he came back with an amazing set of photographs of K2 by his photographer called Vittorio Sella. And these made a real impact in Europe because people saw these beautiful peaks, these kind of incredibly difficult looking mountains, and naturally their difficulty made them attractive. And so a lot of mountaineers were inspired by Abruzzi. In the 1930s, all of the expeditions were American. And again, there was this sort of, in a way, the kind of big mountains, the Himalayas and the Karakoram, had been divvied up. And Everest was known as the British mountain. Nanga Parbat was known as the German mountain. And K2 briefly became known as the American mountain because there were so many American expeditions. It's interesting, if you look at this picture, they're all kind of rich American students from Harvard and Yale. In the bottom, they're Sherpas, because at this time, the Sherpas had a reputation garnered on British Everest expeditions as being fantastic high-altitude porters. And so they took part in the early American expeditions. The second American expedition got very close to K2 in 1939, almost got to the top, led by this extraordinary German character called Fritz Wiesner. But it was a very controversial expedition because one of the Americans died and 3 Sherpas died at the end of the expedition. And there was and it happened in 1939, just before war broke out. An expedition which was American but led by a German who emigrated to America, and it was a very controversial, very difficult time as they tried to work out why this man here, Dudley Wolford, died. It's a great story. In 1953, at the same time as the British went to Everest, the Americans came back and tried to climb K2 again, and this is the American team. Again, a fantastic story of an expedition where they put their heart and soul into it, but everything went wrong. And another American climber died, a character called Art Gilkey. In the foreground, this is Muhammad Atta Ullah, who was a Pakistani liaison officer attached to the team. So by the end of 1953, there had been 5 expeditions to K2. Nobody got to the top, and it had started to get a reputation for being this very dangerous mountain because people kept on dying on it. If you look at where they actually got to, the early expeditions, Crowley and Abruzzi, only got really at the bottom of the mountain, didn't get up it at all. Fritz Wiesner almost got to the top, got within 600 feet of the summit, but didn't quite make it. In 1954, though, and this is what I'm going to talk to you mainly about, an Italian expedition came back, and it was led by an Italian geography professor called Ardito Desio, who'd been and done some. This is a picture of a geographical expedition in the 1930s. The Italians felt a kind of affinity with Pakistan in the sense that they were both kind of very mountainous countries. They felt themselves to be kind of mountain people, and they had sent expeditions in 1909, in the 1930s, and in 1954 they got their chance to make an attempt on K2. And this is a clip. I hope it's going to work.
Yeah, just press it once more. Press it, do that.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is, to give you a flavour of what the expedition was like, this is a clip from the Italian K2 movie called Italian K2. I'll talk over it because it's in Italian, and I'm assuming there's not that many Italian speakers here. What was interesting about it was that it was very organised. That before they went to Pakistan, the leader of the expedition, who, as I say, was a lecturer at Milan University, he got together with the cream of Italian mountaineers, a lot of professional mountain guides, and he kind of instructed them on what they should do. And they would have seminars, and he would make them read the books from previous expeditions. And they had a very elaborate setup where they had decompression chambers, which would simulate what it was like to be at high altitude. And they would use these decompression chambers to make the climbers see what it's like to kind of work at 8,000 meters. That was a theory. And so you can see there, so this is Milan University, I think, and they've got these two poor Italians who are inside. They've sucked all the air out, reduced the pressure, and so they're supposed to be experiencing, what it's like to be at high altitude. Because that's always been one of the issues for anybody going to a big mountain is the physical realities of being in an oxygen-starved environment at very low pressure, which can often lead to a lot of sicknesses. They were using oxygen equipment. This was one of the innovations from the 1950s, that it became available to help you get up these very tall mountains. So that gives you a kind of, and in the 1950s, nowadays when you think about mountaineering and climbing, it's very much about kind of individuals and kind of achieving a personal goal. But in the 50s, it was seen as a very kind of, it was a national issue. Britain had climbed Everest, and this was a massive moment of national triumph. And similarly, Italy thought if they could climb, an Italian team could climb K2, it would be a moment of national renewal for this country which had come out of the Second World War in not such a good state. So Ardito Desio, the leader of the expedition, put together a crack team, a very large team, and they brought with them a large group of Hunza porters. Sherpas weren't allowed into Pakistan at this point because they were considered to be Indian citizens and relations weren't so good. But they found in the kind of Hunza high altitude porters another kind of extremely strong race of innate mountaineers, if you like. It was a very well-funded expedition. They flew around K2. They walked in with an enormous team and an enormous number of porters, passed, as Johnny has talked about this, through this extraordinary landscape, and set up what in those days would have been considered a huge base camp, which they called the New Italopolis of K2. And they had a mess tent, they had a radio tent, they had a statue of the Virgin Mary presented to them by the Archbishop of Milan, and they got ready to stage a kind of siege of the mountain, and had brought with them an enormous quantity of supplies and of oxygen, prepared to stay for months, and gradually started working their way up the mountain. In those days, the approach was called siege mountaineering. You would maybe have 10 camps between the top and the bottom, and you would go from one camp to the next, to the next, to the next, until you could get within striking distance of the summit. Very exposed, unpredictable weather, which might be good one day and a complete raging storm the next. Very early in the expedition, there was a death. One of the climbers called Mario Puchoz died of suspected altitude sickness. This really spooked them. They thought that this one of the strongest climbers died quite low down on the mountain. A lot of the other climbers were very worried about this. But nevertheless, they kept on going. And this is another clip from the expedition film to give you a sense of what it was like at these sort of altitudes. You can see a lot of snow. This is the big fear for anybody climbing big mountains, is that you'll get to a point where there's huge dumps of snow, which makes it very hard to move around, very avalanche prone. They brought vast quantities of oxygen with them, but they didn't actually use them. Their equipment, compared to kind of modern day clothing, for example, was very primitive. But at the same time, it was the best that was available at the time. They put an enormous amount of rope up the mountain, the theory being that they would be able to go up and down, back and forward to base camp and recuperate after kind of arduous climbing. But you can get a sense of just the sheer verticality of K2 and, from this footage. You know, this is quite low down on the mountain, but very, very difficult climbing. You know, and this is Gino Solda. He's having a problem breathing. It's saying, you know, because at high altitude, with a lower amount of oxygen, you're both ventilating a lot, you're breathing in and out a lot, but yet there's not as much air, there's not as much oxygen, and the pressure is lower, so it's harder to get oxygen into your body. The Hunza porters were a vital part of the team because their job was basically to carry the supplies up, which would enable the Italian climbers to forge ahead and find the best route. Very difficult, very tricky climbing, and very hard to find places to put a tent, because there were so few places on the mountain which were flat. Ardito Desio, the leader of the expedition, he was much older than most of the climbers and had a very professorial attitude. And he spent a lot of his time on the radio to them, and he would send up messages urging them on. And this is a typical message which he sent getting towards the climax of the expedition. If you succeed in scaling the peak, as I'm sure you will, the entire world will hail you as champions of your race. Even if you never achieve anything else of note, you'll be able to say that you've not lived in vain. And this was just to give you the feeling that this was seen as it's a little bit like what, going to the moon, going to the South Pole, going to the North Pole, that K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, but because it had this reputation for being so difficult, that it was seen as this extreme challenge, so the Italians really wanted it. By the end of July, they were almost at the summit. They'd reached about 26,600 feet. And there'd been a lot of false starts, but for once they got a good weather window. And they knew that they had a couple of good days and there might be a chance of getting to the summit. A vital issue was getting oxygen up to the summit team, the two men who were going to go for the top. And it fell to Walter Bonatti, a very young Italian mountaineer, and Amir Mahdi, one of the Hunza porters, to carry up the oxygen supplies for them, a vital role in the expedition. But finally, the two climbers, Compagnoni and Lacedelli, set off for the summit, and this is them talking about it.
Lino Lacedelli and Achille Compagnoni made the final push up the mountain at 6 p.m. on the 31st of July 1954. They reached the long, narrow ridge of ice which forms the summit of K2.
The summit one is, but I could see it there, the summit. There was no more to go. And I was indeed very emotional. I stayed there for several minutes, just leaning against my disaster to get my breath back. See, they can also about the need. Whatever happens next, we'll reach the summit. We shook hands, we looked around, so looking at the mountains, and we aimed them to check that we were thinking straight. But we never felt truly happy because we knew how difficult it would be to get down. Compagnoni got out into sickness, and he said, I'm tired, I stay here, and that's the rest here. I said, no, we're not going down. And if you don't, I'll give you a bash with his biceps. We have to be tough on ourselves. So we said, okay, put my gloves on, because neither of us will be by ourselves. But the left came off, and disappeared. So I said, here, have mine. And he said, all right then, let's go.
News of their heroic ascent was broadcast around the world.
So that's Compagnoni and Lacedelli, both who are dead now, talking about that ascent. When Lacedelli talked about giving Compagnoni his glove, by doing that he had guaranteed that he would get frostbite. And indeed that happened, and I don't know if you noticed that both of them had got fingers missing. Compagnoni lost 2 fingers, Lacedelli lost 1. But they planted the Italian flag on the summit, and they came back down, and they had achieved what all the American expeditions had failed to do, got to the top of what was by then regarded as the world's toughest mountain. They sent a telegram back to Italy. I'm very happy to announce the Italian conquest of the 2nd highest mountain in the world on the 31st of July. This was huge news in Italy. As I say, it was their Everest moment. The flag is on top of K2. The Italian conquest of the 2nd highest mountain in the world. This was a massive story in Italy, and a big story in the rest of the world, but bigger for the Italians. At first they didn't want to say who had actually reached the summit. The team had an agreement that they wouldn't reveal that. And so they kept the names hidden, but everybody sort of worked out, the journalists worked out ultimately, that it must have been Compagnoni and Lacedelli, partly because of the frostbite that they'd suffered. So the Italian team had come and they'd done exactly what they'd set out to do. They'd conquered K2. But unfortunately, this isn't a story which had a happy ending, because for the next 50 years, and next 50 years after this first ascent, they argued about exactly how it was achieved. The leader of the expedition, Ardito Desio, fell out with the club who had organised it, the Italian Alpine Club, over money. Compagnoni, one of the climbers on the summit, he sued the film production team for the frostbite that had happened to his fingers because he'd been filming on the summit, this kind of remarkable thing. Famously, Walter Bonatti and Compagnoni fell out over details of exactly how they got to the summit, whether the oxygen had run out before they got there, and basically spent 50 years arguing about it. And it's a kind of a little bit of a sad postscript to the story, but at the same time it's a kind of typical K2 story in that this is a mountain which is very extreme, where very extreme things happen to people. And it was sort of par for the course in some respects, that it wouldn't be a kind of simple story. These are pictures of the first Pakistanis to reach the summit of Everest, Nazir Sabir and Ashraf, of K2, Nazir Sabir and Ashraf Aman. And this was an expedition from 2014, a Pakistani-Italian expedition, where most of the climbers this time around were Pakistanis, and they succeeded in doing this on the 60th anniversary, which was a great way to round up the story. But K2, people often come back to the name, a very simple, bare name, an austere name for an austere mountain, and a mountain which has got tremendous history and tremendous stories to it. And that's what my book is about. But but also, you know, that's why, I mean, everyone in England knows the story of Everest, and people trek every year in their thousands to Everest Base Camp. But the trek to K2 Base Camp is much more dramatic. If you want a little bit of rugged mountaineering or a little feel of what it's like to get really into the heart of the mountains, the K2 trek is just much more raw and a much more different world than, if you like, going to Everest Base Camp, which is a very beautiful journey, but it feels a bit more like Switzerland a lot of the time. Pine-clad forests, tea houses everywhere. K2, you don't get any of that. You get a long walk, a difficult walk, but tremendous mountains to see on the way in, and a tremendous experience to have.
Nick has just basically sold our K2 trip for us. I think the 28th of August this year, if you're not doing anything or want to go to K2, you can do it with us. So there you are. What I would also like to say is that Nick's book is absolutely gripping. I bought a copy when I met Nick at Destinations. I took it with me to Cambodia. I didn't want to leave my hotel room. I was just standing through it the whole time. I gave it to my wife Anna, and the other night, 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up and I think, why is the light still on? And Anna's busy still reading the book. Doesn't turn the light out. It's absolutely gripping. It's not a story of mountaineering, really. It's a story of so much more intrigues and human endeavour. It's really a fantastic book. And I see Mick's even got some paperbacks, which I didn't know were out yet. So afterwards, Mick will be doing a signing. So if anybody wants to get some, please do. It's a really, really fantastic book. So our next speaker, Matthew Green, is a journalist and author who was based in Pakistan for 3 years, where he worked for the Financial Times and as a special correspondent for Reuters. After spending 14 years as a foreign correspondent, Matthew returned to the UK in 2013 to write his new book, Aftershock, The Untold Story of Surviving Peace, which documents post-conflict experiences of British soldiers. Matthew appears regularly as a commentator on the BBC News Channel and the World Service Radio, and has written for publications including The Guardian, Newsweek and Monocle. To tell us about an amazing trek that Matthew took last year across one of the region's mighty glaciers, please welcome Matthew Green.
The first ascent of K2 without oxygen is quite a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best to keep you entertained for a few minutes with my trip last summer across the Biafo Hispar Glacier Complex in the Karakoram region of Pakistan. It turned out, and I didn't know this before we started, that we'd be following in the footsteps of some rather intriguing explorers who traversed this region well before the Italians, and I'll be speaking a little bit about them over the next few minutes. I should say though, when I first set out to do this trip, I actually wanted to go to the K2 base camp. That was the original plan. And it's a nice little connection from the last talk that it was actually Nazir Sabir, the first Pakistani to climb K2, who organised our trip. And we were all set up to go to the K2 base camp. The permits for my 2 friends who actually lived in Pakistan at the time didn't come through. So Nazir said to us, well, look, you can't go to K2 base camp. Why don't you try this alternative route instead? It's a little bit similar. You go up one glacier and come down the other side, and you get to visit this incredible feature, the Snow Lake, which you can see in this picture, this quasi-mystical ice cap, which fascinated generations of explorers before us. I wouldn't say we were explorers, more like tourists, and we were certainly not as prepared as we should have been, as you'll see in a few minutes. Here's a little map. I don't know how clear that is. You can see Skardu in the south there, the gateway to the region. If you look just up, there's Ascoli, which is the village, which is the trailhead, I think, also for K2 base camp. But we branched off to the left. You can see I hope you can make out the Biafo Glacier. So we walked up that to the Hispar Pass, and the Snow Lake is just there, and then down the Hispar Glacier on the other side. That's about 110 kilometers end to end, and takes about 10 days. As I mentioned, we were by no means the first people to take this expedition. The first foreign visitor to the Snow Lake was Sir Martin Conway, who arrived in 1892, a very famous explorer and art historian. After him, this rather formidable lady, Fanny Bullock Workman, with her husband William Hunter Workman, very wealthy American explorers who went all over the world and particularly fascinated with the Karakoram. They also approached the Snow Lake, which they took to be a kind of third pole almost, an ice cap, which was the source of all the ice streams in the region. And they estimated it to be 300 square miles in surface area, which wasn't quite accurate. And they would be set straight by these two, Eric Shipton and Harold Tillman, again celebrated interwar explorers who made a seminal expedition across the Karakoram in 1936 and crossed the Snow Lake. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences from Eric Shipton's book, Blank on the Map, in which he describes his expedition. It rather sums up our own feelings before we started. At this stage, my plans were necessarily vague, but I was fascinated by the idea of penetrating into the little-known region of the Karakoram. As I studied the maps, one thing about them captured my imagination. The ridges and valleys which led up from Baltistan became increasingly high and steep as they merged into the maze of peaks and glaciers of the Karakoram, and then suddenly ended in an empty blank space. Across this blank space was written one challenging word: unexplored. Now, it wasn't unexplored when we arrived, but our plans were unfortunately rather vague. As I mentioned, it was very much a last-minute decision to take on this trip, but we didn't quite realise what we were in for. This is a view from our hotel at Skardu, where fortunately we were able to pick up a few last-minute essentials like carabiners, ice poles, crampons, things that you probably want to take with you up a glacier, but which we'd not been told to pack according to Plan A. From here, you drive up to Ascoli, but the night before we started, our guide, a wonderful gentleman called Atta Khan, who I believe is also a, I'm not sure, moonlighting with Royal Frontiers, or whether he's an interview. I don't know, well, I'll leave you to sort that one out. A wonderful figure who you'll see his picture in a few moments, but he got us all together and we were, having our dinner, and he told us a little story about a few years earlier he'd taken a group up this glacier, and one of the gentlemen in the group, a Canadian, wasn't really into following his instructions. Now, there was a reason that Atta insisted that everybody did exactly what he says, and that reason is the crevasses, which are found all the way along Hispar and Biafo glaciers. Again, not something I'd heard about as we were getting on pre-deployment briefing. These glaciers get very thin sheets of ice forming over them, a bit like a trapdoor, you might say. So if you don't look where you're going, there's quite a good chance of falling through one of them and never being seen again, which he took great delight in explaining to us. One of the members of his previous expeditions, a Canadian man, wandered off, didn't say where he was going, didn't follow the instructions, inevitably fell down a crevasse. Fortunately, one of the porters spotted him. Atta had to tie 4 10-meter ropes together to reach him. They managed to pull him out in a sort of tug-of-war type scenario, got this guy out. Obviously, he was shaken, but he seemed unharmed, until the next morning, when it turned out he'd got a broken ankle. He compounded his first error by insisting that they continue with the expedition. So the porters fashioned a kind of a sled for part of the way, I think over the Snow Lake. He ended up being carried by piggyback at one point, then loaded onto a donkey on the lower slopes, and he completed the trek in a wheelbarrow. So, this was, I don't believe this was an apocryphal story. I think it was 100% true, and it certainly meant that we followed Atta's instructions to the letter. You've seen these sorts of terrain before as we ascended higher towards Ascoli, incredible shift in the geology, one of those trusty jeeps that we took. And then getting to the start of the Biafo Glacier. Now, I've not been to K2, to the K2 base camp, but I understand there is at least something of a trail, right? That's not the case on this trip. You're very much blazing your own trail. And in fact, it turns out we were the first people to manage this trip that last year, maybe even the last as well. altitude is quite tough, and it was quite chilling to hear what you were saying, Mike, about the K2 trip. I mean, I found myself on the first day succumbing, and I was walking up the glacier, started vomiting, fortunately ended up getting into a tent and sort of just taking a rest. There were 3 of us on this trip, me and a couple, my friends. The husband was in both the French Foreign Legion and served as a captain in the US 82nd Airborne Division. So probably the kind of guy you want to have on a trip like this. He told me after I recovered that he'd spent the evening mapping out a potential helicopter landing pad for me to be shipped off the mountain on the first day, but fortunately it didn't end as badly as that. It is a beautiful climb up. There's a picture of Atta, our guide, grinning away there. You can see the sort of glacial terrain that you're navigating, getting up higher into the mountain. And there really is very little to navigate by. You do occasionally see cairns in the distance, which you can follow. But this is really deserted. I mean, there's no villages here, there's nobody. To give you a sense of the sort of isolation, one of the only 2 people we met on the whole trip was a 70-year-old Pakistani shepherd who we met at the very end, named Shaban Ali. He looked very disconsolate because the previous evening a snow leopard had eaten one of his yak calves. So that's the kind of problem you have to contend with in this region. Obviously his loss was our porter's gain, and they had yak steak for dinner, so it wasn't all a bad story, but it just gives you a sense of the kind of terrain that we're navigating. There's some of the cairns there. This is getting about halfway up. I mean, obviously I'm trying to make out how hard it was. We did have wonderful catering, and I'm sure you'd have similar on a Wild Frontiers expedition. This is Said Jan, who's something of a legendary mountain cook, or chef I should say, and he's been up with some of these incredible expeditions up on K2. Managed to serve wonderful food every day, 3 times a day, with the help of this rather temperamental kerosene stove. He also does an incredible range of moonshine that is brewed from his own mulberry plantation or mulberry orchard in the Hunza Valley. I've got to say, I didn't touch it. I just couldn't even. I mean, I should say that I was pushed to the edge of physical and psychological collapse pretty much every day on this trip. And I couldn't. The idea of compounding that with mulberry moonshine just wasn't happening. But my friend from the French Foreign Legion did partake, and I must say the next morning was the only time he actually started to fall behind the rest of us. Quite satisfying, actually. Anyway, so that gives a little sense of the kind of load the porters were carrying. We had a modest party. There were 3 of us on the trip and 42 porters. So that gives you a sense. There's some sort of algorithm which I don't understand, but obviously when you have a certain number of porters, then you need more porters to carry those porters' equipment, and then obviously more to and we took a couple of goats and 2 chickens, which didn't survive the trip. Here's Atta and another guide roping up. This is something we learned to do on the way. Apparently, I mean, I'm sure you're probably supposed to have some sort of qualification to do this, but Atta was very helpful. He pointed out the key thing, which I didn't know. Obviously, if there's a crevasse, or a hidden crevasse, it's quite helpful to be approaching it perpendicular. So if it does collapse and someone falls in, you can pull him out. If you walk horizontally, obviously if one person falls in, everyone will fall in. And again, he took great delight in explaining this in some detail. But I'm here, so you know, it was okay in the end. They're getting nicely firmly roped up. This now is the final ascent towards the snow lake, about halfway through. Again, interesting to hear what you were saying about your walk through the night. Obviously, it's much easier when the snow is compacted and cold and frozen. I mean, I'm using the word easy in a relative sense here. It's not an easy climb towards the end, but absolutely spectacular. You can see here, that's actually not one of my photos. I should mention that the snow lake was where Shipton and Tillman saw the footprints of what they claimed to be the Yeti. Now, or in Latin, Homo nivalis abominabalis, if they like to call him. There's a long controversy about whether or not the Yeti does actually exist, as you probably know, and there's some great books on it. But suffice to say, we didn't see any footprints. Slightly disappointing, but we were certainly in the vicinity. That's the view when you get to the top. And you can see now why Fanny Bullock Workman may have got a little bit lyrical in her descriptions of the idea of this third pole on the roof of the world. coming down here on the other side. And then the porters still forging ahead there, very fortunate to have them. And then this is looking down into the Hunza, into the Hispar Glacier, which you walk down for the next 4 or 5 days to get to the very end. And you can see the peaks of Hunza at the end there. That was my tent. I must have done something to offend the rest of the expedition. When I look back at it now, I wonder whether we were probably all on the verge of falling out with each other, like the Italians. Actually, no, it was great. I mean, it was obviously a wonderful trip. I feel very privileged to have had that opportunity. And I could thoroughly recommend anybody going up to the northern areas of Pakistan. It really is a trip of a lifetime. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much indeed, Matt. That was brilliant. Fantastic trip. Very tough by the looks of it. By the way, how high was that pass? Oh, I should have mentioned, it's 5,151 metres.
Whoa.
So
seriously high.
Yeah, it's
5,100 metres. That's very high. Right, finally, before we wrap up, I'm going to ask one of our best clients, Susie Dowell, to come up and just have answer a few questions from a kind of female perspective. We've obviously had the opinion of Pakistan from the guys. There are a lot of women in the audience, a lot of Wild Frontiers clients, of course, women. And so I'm going to ask Susie to come up and just have a bit of a chat with us about what it's like travelling to Pakistan as a woman. Thank you, Susie. So first of all, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to come up.
I wish you told me about the wheelbarrow option.
Susie did come to K2 with us. But so Susie, maybe first of all, if you wouldn't mind just saying a little bit about which trips you've done and what your overall kind of impressions of travelling in Pakistan are like.
Sure. Yes, so I went in about, was it 2000?
2000.
Yes, yeah, on the trip through Peshawar up to Chitral, across the top Chandor Pass, Eagle's Nest, and down that Johnny was talking about, which I loved so much that I persuaded several friends to come back with me a few years later. And in fact, just absorbing it all this evening, I'm quite tempted to go again. But a fantastic trip. And then one evening over a drink, Johnny persuaded me to do the K2 trip, which they'd never done before. So, and it's very easy sitting in a pub to say, yes, you'd love to do it. Anyway, so off we went, and all three were very, in their ways, different experiences. I adored seeing the Kailash, as you can imagine, and staying with them. Found Pakistan so beautiful, I've never seen anything like it since, and I've travelled a lot. Found it very hospitable. Quite rough, quite basic. I'm a bit of a London girl, so, you know, but nothing that you can't handle. And yes, just absolutely loved it all. The K2 trip was very hard. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also probably the most satisfying thing I've ever done. And when I got home, I felt very chuffed with myself, and I kissed my kitchen cupboards when I walked through them.
I should think you kissed your bed as well, Susie, if you don't mind me saying so. On our packing list, it has blow-up inflatable mat.
You'll be horrified.
So what this normally means, a thing called thermarest, which is very neat, rolls up in something this big. Susie came with something that you would put in a one-bedroom flat in London for a guest coming to stay. A double bed, this big, this fat, and exactly where your trek started, there's a little campsite there, it punctured.
But it kept getting fixed, and then the pump eventually, with the altitude, gave out. Yeah. And so I was worse off than anyone who brought one of the
Absolutely. You were saying, is there anything, travelling as a woman, and it is obviously impossible for me to know, being that I travel as a man, but as a woman, where you were saying sometimes you do feel that you get looked at in a particular way.
Yes, very much so. And in fact, in the more remote towns, certainly, you almost never see any women, except for when we're staying with the Kailash. So you are an object, I think, of curiosity. And it can feel like hostility, but it's not. It's curiosity. And I think as long as you're properly covered and properly dressed, then it's not a problem at all.
Any tips you give on the dressing front or anything?
Well, Johnny, when we first arrived in Peshawar, he said he gave us a lecture about what to wear. And then he said it's really nice to go and get a shower kameez made, which you can get done overnight. And it's a very decent way of dressing, and it's very convenient as well. And so we went to this place in the bazaar, and there's all these bolts of cloth, choose your colours. So I chose a beautiful sky blue and some rather stylish white for the trousers. And there was something going on when I was being measured. You know, sometimes there's a joke and you're not in on it and no one's telling you. Anyway, so we picked them up the next day, and then the first time I wore them, there was lots of laughing, and some kind soul took pity on me and told me that it was the National Girls' School uniform. So there was this 6-foot woman of God knows what age I was, wearing this ridiculous uniform, which I then left in a fury in a hotel room in the hope that some tall schoolgirl would find it.
I'm trying to find a photograph of Susie in that outfit. But
There isn't one.
I didn't have one. And anything else? I know sometimes there are issues finding loose tops, for one thing, can be...
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, let's not get too basic about it, but on the K2 trip particularly, Atta was sensational about making sure that we all drank enough, because it's terribly important, obviously. And so you have soup for breakfast. I'm sure you had the same cook, actually, Matthew, and soup for lunch and water all the time. And Atta used to say to me, have you drunk your water bottle? No, you haven't. You need to drink the water bottle. Fill it up again. So consequently, I was always looking for a boulder. Really, pretty well all the time. John used to say, what, again? And then a porter would come around the corner just as you were ready. So it was always a bit of a hazard, but actually after a few days it just so didn't matter.
Yeah, it is one of the problems we have, you know, not so much on K2 where you can generally find a boulder to go and pee behind, but when you're on the road trip going up, say, from Islamabad to Chitral, finding convenient places for the ladies to kind of go to the loo, so I'm kind of stopping everyone drinking their second cup of coffee first thing in the morning. And so, Susie, overall, would you recommend Pakistan as a destination for...
Well, quite clearly I would. Yes, I think it's a really, it's an unusual place to go. It's so beautiful, I can't think why more people don't go. And it's fascinating, the history, the people are wonderful, and it's absolutely unforgettable, it really is.
Thank you very much, Susie. So finally, just really to say thank you so much to all of you guys for coming. It's a great turnout, as you know. We kind of sold out and had to kind of stop some people coming. It's been brilliant to see that there is so much interest in tourism to Pakistan, and rightly so. And also, I would just like to once again thank Dr. Hussain and IJLA for inviting us here to give a talk at this wonderfully prestigious place. So thank you all so much indeed for coming. I do just have one final job to do, which is the raffle prize. Naz, I don't know if you want to... Susie, come on up. You can choose the tickets. Go over there and read it out.
Hold up for it, give it a good shake. Hold on, I'll get
Give it a shake, right? We've got some really cool prizes, not least of which, in fact, the main prize is a £500 travel voucher with Wild Frontiers. But this isn't for this. This is for the bottom prize, which is...
First two are book bundles.
First two bundle of books, which includes Mick's amazing book. So, yes, so, no, sorry.
Yeah.
174. And 171, so you better shake them around a bit, Susie. 174? 171? No, okay, good.
Yeah.
You've got both of them. I tell you what, look, we're going to put one back in and shake it up again. Do you mind? Because it's the same books, so you've got to do it. Okay, 386. So one bundle of here. Oops, sorry.
I'll pass that through, it's probably easier.
Sorry, 386. I'll let you spend a bit of time pulling the numbers out. I mean, I've actually got some somewhere as well, so look at mine.
You haven't got any.
If I find it.
You're not allowed to win.
It's my books, isn't it? Oh, no, not me. Sorry, 386. Oh, 386 over there. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And now we are on to the £30 Cotswold Outdoor Camping, 333. Oh, yeah, Stuart, great, down the back.
Where's Stuart?
Now the second big one, which is a brilliant rucksack. Stuart, over there, matey. An amazing rucksack donated by Nomad Travel Store, full rucksack with a day pack, which sits on the side. There you go. And that is 226.
which can be 226, sorry, 226. That can be used on a welcome to
226. Yeah.
Heady, well done you. Good stuff. And finally, the £500 travel voucher. In fact, I'm pleased Heady didn't win that, I'd just knock it off the next trip. £500 travel voucher, which is 396. 396? 396. 396. Oh, there we are at the back. Brilliant. Round this side, well done. Fantastic. So finally, I think Islam would just like to thank once again Islam and Dr. Hussain for inviting us here. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.